Thank you, Julie, for the very nice comment. I'm very honored to be speaking at the Dean's lecture tonight, and thank you to Julie for the invitation, and to Piyush Tiwari for your support, and also your colleagues in administration who put in a lot of efforts to organize this trip for me down to the last detail, like providing me a card to take the tram from Collins Street to the campus. That's planning for you. This is part of the school planning. Now, there's one other person I have to thank, and who is very instrumental in getting me here, and he's my old mate, Peter Holland. And old is the operative word. Peter, as you know, is the chairman of the Property Advisory Board here, and he broached the subject of doing this probably about 18 months ago. Unfortunately, I couldn't do it the first time, and I thought that was it. But he came back and made me an offer I couldn't refuse, including throwing in some goodies like, oh, let's spend the weekend, we go visit some winery at the Mornington Peninsula, play some golf. Guess what? Things changed, my schedule, this one is not his fault though, my schedule changed, and I could only come for 3 days and everything's got compressed. So you got away with it. Thank you, Peter, for that. So, you know, it's always nice to return to Australia, and some of you would know that I lived here for a long time, almost 20 years ago, but that was a long time ago, and that I never really had a chance to live in Melbourne. I live in the other big smoke, and some would say a bigger smoke, and just call Sydney. But I make a lot of trips here on business when we're here, and a couple of my old colleagues and friends are sitting down there grinning at me. So it's wonderful to be back. It's actually in Sydney that I started my property career with Jones Lang Wotton. That was almost 40 years ago, not quite. And that was after a short stint trying to be an academic. And as I say, the rest is history. So I've been fortunate that my career spanned a period of time where the industry underwent some fundamental changes, and of course I learned a great deal from it. So tonight we'll to share with you a perspective of how the industry's evolved over time, over the last 40 years, and then to share with you some thoughts about what the future might hold, right? So, basically I'm going to try to answer two questions, and that's the outline of what I'm going to speak about tonight. So the first question is, what are the transformative changes in the last 40 years that shaped the global real estate industry? The second question is a futuristic question, is would the macro forces and trends that we are currently witnessing fundamentally change the real estate business as we know it now? In the early years, the industry was relatively simple, right? 40 years ago. Looking back when I first started my career, the single biggest difference, I guess, is the word choice. Choice from every standpoint, not just from a career standpoint. The career choices then were very narrow. Now, you have a wide range of career, but also in terms of the range of products out there in the market, the investment vehicles, the platforms, all the different sources of capital. And that explains why there's a wide range of career for people with property background. Now, so looking back, basically I picked up three big game-changing development. And the first is that real estate became a strategic asset class in an institutional portfolio. So it moves from basically an owner-occupied market to having an investment market globally. I'll go through each one of these later on in a little bit of detail. And the next big change is the integration of real estate with the capital markets, moving from bricks and mortar to finance. And the third big change is the internationalization of real estate, transforming from a domestically focused market. In fact, most markets around the world were very domestic focused to a global business. There is actually a fourth factor, which is more an enabling factor. During this period, I was improving quality of information, and without that, much of the changes that we're seeing through these three developments that I talked about would not have happened, because you needed quality information for the institution to be able to measure performance. So those were the changes. Some of these changes were in response to new opportunities and market developments. Others were adaptation to severe market upheavals and traumas, which the industry has to endure during this period. It's not all blue sky in the last 40 years. Now, so let me go through, well, before I say that, of course, the question of data will come back up later on when we talk about technology. Now we're entering a different era of big data analytics, AI, machine learning, and so on. It put a new perspective on how things can change over time. So let's go through each one of these separately. So as I said, in the beginning, it's a very simple industry. It was mainly built for own occupation. The commercial, here I'm talking about commercial real estate market, of course, that they were basically owned, built by individuals, families, or corporates for their own use, right? And there was very little institutional participation. So in a sense, the real estate market is quite detached from if you like, from the financial world. In the early 70s, as you know, some of you will know that the US or the world went through a period of very high inflation. So there was this movement in the US to use the then CAPM model, the capital asset pricing model, to push for the inclusion of real estate as an asset class in an institutional portfolio. So the traditional classes were fixed income, or we call them bonds, and public equities, right? These real estates, infrastructure, PE, private equities, and still called alternative investment classes. But up until then, it didn't happen, right? And the reason behind using CAPM is to say that it plays the role for diversification of risk and for hedging inflation. So this was this eventually happened, and the U.S. pension funds investment in commercial real estate grew very rapidly from only about $5 billion in the 1970s to $200 billion in the 90s. It was a 40-fold increase. Now, looking at right, so this is so the development institution become market, and that happened in the US in a big way, and then it started to happen in the rest of the world. In Australia, following the Campbell inquiry, it led to a progressive deregulation of the financial market in the 80s and the 90s. And that led to a growth in institutional investment in real estate. But the problem here is that when there's too much of a good thing, when there's a lot of money flowing into any sector, you start to see some negative things coming out. So that, not just in Australia, but particularly in the US and the UK, in a lot of developed markets, it led to one of the worst recession in the commercial real estate market around the world, especially the office market. And this was a big problem around the world. But the result of all that, after suffering, I mean, at one stage, I remember in the early 90s, there was such a massive oversupply of office overhang in Chicago that people were talking about it would take 10 years to absorb the supply, the new supply. And we have the same problem in Sydney and Melbourne in the early 90s in Australia. I think some of us lived through that period, and it was tough. But like all things, when you have, that is always a silver lining, and this fundamentally changed how the industry operates. So there therefore becomes the higher demand, a demand for higher standards in real estate investment management, which then led to the broadening and deepening of the investment market with enhanced professionalism, more rigor in investment analysis and management, and it led to a proliferation of specialist professionals. I'm talking about not just the property people, but any related profession, whether it's in accounting, law, finance, banking, and so on. All kinds of specialists and fund management and so on. So the other thing, of course, there's a continuous improvement in the quality of information for performance measurement purposes. And also innovations and new products, which nicely lead me to the next slide, which is talking about the integration with the capital market. Now, in the early years, the industry, the property investment market was simply building, buying an asset, and then hold it, collect rent, right? And getting some of the funding from the banks. This hasn't changed. And this will continue to be the case. In a sense, as I said earlier on, that the property industry sits on its own, is not very connected with the rest of the capital market. So the industry has since evolved and innovated and become fully integrated. The upheavals in the early 1990s, as I said earlier on, was the catalyst to accelerate this transformation. And new ways of doing business started to emerge. So innovation in the early 90s enabled the equity and debt components in the underlying capital structure of an asset to become tradable. So now you can trade equity and debts both in the public and private market. And this led to what's called the four-quadrant approach to investment. In other words, if you look at the four quadrants, you can do it in the public or private market, or you can be in debt or equity, and as you can see, that the new products that we take for granted now were then starting to emerge, right? What this means is that the market became more liquid, there's much more funds moving into real estate. Now, both the CMBS, which is commercial mortgage-backed securities, which are great innovation, and REITs were innovative solutions to alleviate the massive non-performing loans assets that were during what in the US called the S&L crisis. For those of you who are older now, you will remember the saving and loans crisis in the United States. And that, in fact, is a trigger point for many of these new products that appeared. So the debt market grew very rapidly, and you can see the CMBS became a new source of capital, and the more available, higher availability of capital when the CMBS market became more developed. In fact, the next slide will show that it actually shot up very, very quickly over a span of about 10 years before the GFC killed it all. So it moved, as you can see from the graph, from about $5 billion in 1990 to a peak of $270 billion in 2007, just before the GFC. And then came crushing down during GFC, and it's only just recovered to around about $80 billion. This is the CMBS market in the US. Now this market, however, has not been very developed elsewhere in the world. Let me go back one more. But in the meantime, while the public debt market is happening, the private debt market is also continuing to innovate. So there's again another new source of capital. Real estate debt is being subdivided into different grades, and they become tradable and becoming an investment, a proper investment vehicle even for institutional investor. Again, this is something, private loan is something that happened and highly developed in the US, but I only learned that this so-called, in Australia it's called non-bank sector. This has only just begun in Australia in the last maybe 3 or 4 years. But in the US, this happened since the mid-90s. That's how long it has been, and we can see this market in Australia developing and the non-bank sector. But one concern I have is that in a period when you have large amount of liquidity, when interest rates are low, too much of a good thing may increase the risk of lowering loan standards. And that could be a major problem if it happens. So now on the equity side, this is the debt side. On the equity side, the game changer was the advent of REIT, real estate investment trusts, which led to a surge in the securitization of public real estate equity. Now, although I show you this graph that REIT market has been in the US for a long time, but it really only took off in the early 90s, right, when PIMCO became the first one to become a REIT in the modern era. But Australia has its first trust, the LPT, the Listed Property Trust, and that's GPT. It was listed in 1971. So in many ways, you can say that Australia was ahead of the game then. But of course, in terms of scale, like everything in America, it just took off, and there's a massive scaling up, as this graph shows. Australia will never be this size in terms of REIT, but at the moment, REITs has become a very successful vehicle around the world. The REIT market in terms of scale, the US market in terms of scale is bigger than anybody else. And globally, there are now 37 REIT markets with a total market cap of $1.7 trillion US dollars. That's the size of and growing. We still have new markets yet to open. For example, in China, India has just started its REITs market. So this is another new avenue. And the reason why it is successful as a vehicle and continue to be so, because it provides greater liquidity. It's a new and additional investment vehicle, and it provides access to commercial real estate for smaller investors and a vehicle for asset owners to recycle capital. So that's the reason. Then we'll move on to private equity funds. And this is the area that has been attracting a lot of money in more recent time as well. Again, this was started at the S&L crisis, where then there were a lot of distressed assets. It is another way of pulling funds together to buy distressed asset, to hold it for and value add in some cases, and then sell it off. And these are called opportunity funds. They were all started as opportunity funds. But over the years, they evolved. The private equity funds model evolved, and they moved to value added, what's called value added, which means to say you do something to the assets to improve its quality, and then to core, which are the prime assets. And then there are specialist funds which are sector specific, and in about 2000 they start to do cross-border transactions. So the funds have become global as well. So as you can see from this chart, that the private fund started very slowly. It grew again until just before the GFC. And then it collapsed to an extent, not as bad as the CMBS, and it just reached another peak in 2017. And this is a sector that has been attracting a lot of money in recent years. And the reason being, quite unlike how it started, is because of the low interest rate environment. And that institution, if you looked at the low returns they're getting from bonds and equities, the private equity side is in property or in business, the asset classes that could generate them higher return. Right? So, and that's why they've been attracting a lot of funds. These days, raising $10 billion fund is like a walk in the park for a lot of these big players. 10 years ago, to raise $1 billion was a big deal. So that's the change that's happening to this sector. Now, I want to move now to globalization. I got to be conscious of the time. Today, we take globalization of real estate as a norm, but 25 years ago, in fact, it wasn't common at all. And if you looked at it, there were trickles of cross-border transactions, and they tend to happen in waves between movement between developed markets. So the British UK company were the main player in the 60s, and they in fact invested in Australia. But by the late 1990s, all of them had retreated back to the UK. So company like British Land was very early, they went back much earlier. Then MEPC, which is no longer in existence, and Hammerson's. So what was left in the late 90s was Grosvenor Estates, but I understand even they have retreated back. So then in the 70s, we had the Dutch institutions that invested in the US, then they got caught by the big depression in real estate, they switched to REITs, and in the 80s, we had the Japanese. So it was not until the late 1990s, early 2000 that you see much more cross-border investment from multiple countries, right? So that's become much more of a norm. And there are many reasons why this happened. First of all, as I tried to say early on, is the fact that real estate has become accepted as a strategic asset class in an institutional portfolio. And that's been tremendous growth in the amount of funds accumulated by institutions, and there have been increasing allocation to real estate. So this real estate money needs to find a home, right? And institutions, therefore, are always in search of higher risk-adjusted return, and one of it is through geographical diversification. That's how, within an expanding investment universe. So as a result of which, we also grew a lot of intermediaries to facilitate this cross-border transaction. So that's how we got to where we are now with the kind of foreign investments you are seeing. Here, I'm actually only talking about commercial real estate, so large flows of funds. But of course, residential real estate has been happening for a long time around the world. Now, this is a chart to show you how much the cross-border investment in real estate is happening. That, again, it kind of dropped off at GFC and after GFC, and it started to come back. It's now peaked. It's peaked in 2018, which is slightly higher than the last peak in 2007. I'll tell you a bit about GIC. That I joined GIC in 1996, but GIC, which is the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Singapore, was one of the earliest to have an allocation to real estate, and it started in 1982. Then they were very lonely, and the only place they really went to invest was in the US, because naturally that was the market that was, I guess it has the breadth and depth for institutional investor who didn't want to take too much risk. So even though GIC had the mandate to invest globally, almost all the investments were in the United States. It was not until the late 1980s that it became truly globalized. So in a sense, it was reflecting the change that was happening in the market then. Right? So, and start to invest across the 4 quadrants from the mid-1990s onwards. So I think that's probably enough about the past. So I just wanted to perhaps sum up and the first part, and said that in summary, we now have a globalized real estate market, fully integrated with the capital markets in a vastly expanded investment universe. That's what we have at the moment. Right? However, the challenges and opportunities in the next 40 years are likely to be very different from what they were in the past. I think looking at it, it's quite daunting, but I would say also very exciting, especially for younger people here. So what I want to do now is to look at some of the indication of what could happen, what the future might hold for the industry. So I thought the first item there is a past trend to continue question mark. Really is to say that we picked up some of the things that we are now enjoying and expect to be normal. Would that continue? Right? And then I want to quickly just cover climate change for completeness, which is a big thing. And then changing demographics was another big one. And lastly, disruptive technology, really digital disruption. So those are the areas I want to cover. The first thing is, under the past trends to continue, there are 4 things which I think it's important enough to give it more consideration and not assume that things will continue the way it was. First is the question of whether globalization can continue. The second one is, how is the expanding universe likely to repeat itself from the past, or what would the composition be going forward, or is it going to contract? And then we've been enjoying tremendous growth in investable funds, but is there a limit to it? And then the last point, which I didn't really talk much, but I know it's kind of implicitly talk about it, is the impact of persistent low interest rates. What does that mean for us going forward? So starting with globalization, now the first thing is that we know that definitely globalization has propelled the increase in cross-border flows of capital into real estate. And as I say, most of us have taken this for granted. But if you look at the geopolitics across the globe at the moment, we are seeing a rise in populism, in nationalism, and in protectionism. So and it's certainly threatening to disrupt what we are used to. The geopolitical issues are not just between China and the US. Of course, that's the big one, but we have Brexit. We have the problem between Korea and Japan. We have the EU against the US. So a lot of these things, of course, we always have problems in the Middle East. And so that's a lot of destabilizing factors are starting to happen. So one possible consequence of this is deglobalization. If not, it is already happening. So, for example, would this lead to a curtailment in cross-border investment going forward? Now, if you look at what's happening in the US, the organization which is the equivalent of FIRB, the Foreign Investment Review Board of Australia, is called CFIUS. It's been much more active in scrutinizing foreign investment. And the Chinese investment in the US have already dropped significantly in the US. So the question is that, would foreign investment therefore be not, I guess you cannot extrapolate foreign investment in real estate the way we had been enjoying in the past years. Now, don't forget that barriers to foreign investment 20 or 30 years ago were quite common, right? Well, doesn't mean that we are going to revert back to what we were used to 20, 30 years ago when I started in this industry, in real estate investing cross-border. My sense is that some countries will put up the barriers, but there were others that will open up, right? So the composition and the problem might change, but I don't think that it will be shut completely. Now, this shift, together with other demographic and economic factors, would change the composition of the investment universe, though. The geography will change, right? So let's look at the next point is the question of about expanding investment universe. The first is geography. So in terms of geography, in the last 40 years, most of the expansion was in matured market. However, in terms of geography, the next phase of expansion is likely to be a shift to Asia. With rapid urbanization and a growing middle class with growing spending power, that's going to, and that means with increasing purchasing power will continue to propel Asian cities both in scale, in size, and in quality, in improving the quality of the real estate products. And these cities are going to disproportionately attract investments in infrastructure and real estate compared to the rest of the world. The pool of investment-grade assets will also grow as markets mature to meet higher demand for quality. I would just want to give you a few interesting facts. But before I do that, I want to quote from someone, a source that even most Australians here would know the name, but it would be rather unusual to hear this quote in a very at a point in time which nobody would have thought about this. And the quote is, "Asia is going to be the powerhouse of the future." That was from Harold Holt, Prime Minister of Australia, in December 1967, the day before he drowned. And he, in 1967, saw what could happen to Asia. Now, I'm not sure if you could be surprised at the speed of which that has changed. So, there you are. Unfortunately, he didn't live to see it. So, I want to give you some very interesting stats, as I said, looking at Asia. So, over the next decade, according to Brookings Institute, 88% of the world's new middle class will be Asian. The daily expansion of Asians' new middle class consumers averages about 385,000 citizens, compared to Europe and North America, which will each add around 4,000. So 385,000 versus 4,000. Asia's consumer class is growing 8 times faster than the rest of the world combined. By 2030, China, India, and Indonesia are likely to account for 43% of global consumption, with China alone surpassing the US. Meanwhile, the US share of world consumer spending is forecast to shrink from 13% in 2015 to 7% by 2030. Most of the wealth generation is happening in cities. The top 20 cities in Asia will be amongst the largest in the world with the fastest growing income. Now, I want to put you in some perspective and we draw some Australian comparison. China, India, and Southeast Asia together are now urbanizing at the rate of an Adelaide every 10 days, a Brisbane every 3 weeks, or a Sydney over 1.5 months. That's the rate of urbanization. So you can see that in perspective. So intra-Asia exchanges have also accelerated, accounting for about 60% of the trade, global trade, 68% of inward FDI, and 74% of air traffic. This last statistic surprised me. I hope this is correct. That's not my number. So you can see that more and more of the savings in Asia has been moved into Asia, in investing in recycle within Asia. Unlike in the past, where there are not many investment opportunities, so they tend to go to the matured Western markets. So that's now happening. In fact, if you look at some of the more savvy institutional investors, their allocation to Asia has now moved significantly from what it used to be. They're only limited by the investment opportunities available. By the way, my definition of Asia includes Australia and New Zealand. So let me just show you the next, which is kind of the red lines show the intra-Asia, the red column, property transactions. And you can see is way higher than the other two, right? So in terms of expanding university, the other, of course, apart from geography, you have product types. And so what we're seeing is, of course, many new property asset class now been included, right? Now, for example, student housing is a big deal. Right? Everybody wants a bit of it. And that's because it's getting much more competitive and new areas, new niches have to be found to be included. So that is expanding in that sense. And I also think that you will see all asset types in new market. For example, multifamily, which are rental apartments in the US, has been around for a long time, a very established sector that institutions invest in. Now the UK has rebranded it and call it build to rent versus buy to let. Basically, it's saying that there's now a huge demand for rental accommodations, and these housing are built for rental, and partly as a result of demands from the Millennials, which I'll come to later on. So, but what is probably most game-changing is that real estate bricks and mortar company are invested in areas that are not traditional real estate investment, either for defensive or offensive reason, in order to protect their turf. So, for example, investing in prop tech and other technology-related products, which I'll come to when we get to the last point. So, the next point I want to is there a limit to the growth of investable funds? Now, of course, we know there has been a growing quantum, and not just the base expanding, but the allocation has also, to real estate has also grown. To give you some numbers as a sense of how large the numbers are. So in 2018, the amount of investable fund in the world, the institutional investment funds, I should say, was 55 trillion. It is estimated that this will grow to 100 trillion by 2030. If you think about it, and if you assume there's a 10% allocation to real estate, so that will be an increase from 5.5 trillion to 10 trillion. That's a lot of real estate, new real estate to acquire between now and 2030, right? And so the allocation when 10, 15 years ago, you'd be lucky to get an average of 4 or 5%. Now the average is about 10%, and in some cases, the allocation is much higher than that into real estate. And again, as I said, it is because the traditional asset classes are just not performing. So, but is there a limit to this? Is this going to continue to grow? And I think there might be a limit if you think about it, because there could be a major write-downs in values. And that would trim the accumulated amount of funds going forward. I will expand on this next round. Also, the pension funding has been based on much higher returns in the past. And you just extrapolate that, of course, you're going to get more money. But I think there's a consensus of view now that the returns going forward are likely to be lower than in the past. Right? So, and the other thing is that much of the growth in savings in the past or up until now still is in Asia, in East Asia. Now, if these countries started to grow and mature, they go spend more money in consumption, less will be available in savings to be for investments. So, and the other thing is public finances will be likely to be increasing pressure for a demographic reason when they're facing an aging population. Most of these countries are facing an aging population and some a declining population. And also capital and expenditure and infrastructure to mitigate climate change. So that's going to be pressure on public finances. Now, moving to the next topic, which really is talking about the impact of persisting low interest rates. This is an unprecedented phenomenon. For a long time now, the world has been seeing very low interest rates, which really means that yields, income yields, or in the industry we call cap rate, have been compressed, right? Which means value has been going up. And by historical standard, we would say that prices are very expensive across asset classes and not just real estate. Now, there are plenty of cheap money. Debt has been piling up, rising from, it was 172 billion or in percentage term, 228% of GDP at the peak pre-GFC. It's now exceeded that. It is now globally 248 trillion or 319% of global GDP. So it's a lot more now. And that's because of cheap money. And plenty of it, abundance of liquidity. So many of us, including myself, have been saying for a long time that rates have to return to normal. But if anything, it's still going south. And if the central banks around the world are now bracing for a global recession. So rates are unlikely to move up, at least in the short to medium term. In fact, a fifth of all government bonds globally are producing zero or negative interest. That's the new world that we are dealing with. So this persistently low interest rate environment has tremendous implications for investment strategies. It's really very difficult time, and I used to joke with my colleagues at GIC and said that I'm glad I don't have the responsibility to deploy capital anymore. It is a tough decision, a lot of tough decisions that you have to call, right? Now, where and what assets are you going to invest in an environment like that when you know that things look very expensive and you can't hold cash because interest rates are so low, right? And even if you want to sell, at what prices should you selling? If you hold, would it hold? How long could you hold? So if the question that sort of stayed in my mind is, now that we're seeing low interest rate for so long, in fact, for 40 years, of course the interest rate goes through a different cycle, but each peak and trough was lower than the last one for the last 40 years in real and nominal term. So that seems to be a secular trend. So is this going to continue? If so, it is really very important because a small change in income yield has a huge impact on your value, especially when your yields are low, right? So that, but on the other hand, if you decided that this is going to continue, this is structural, what if we are really hit by a recession, there's a collapse on the demand side, and therefore a fall in value? What is worse is, if yields should then expand because there's a fall off in demand for investment, then you get a double whammy. So that's the current problem for a lot of investment institutional investor. I think there's now been a rethink in the investment world about how you assess different asset classes. For example, in the past, it's you look at different investments, you say this is real estate, so it's called this risks, right? And so therefore you need a higher rate of return. Bonds got much lower risk, so lower rate of return, and so on. They each have their risk-return characteristics. But then if you blindfold someone and say, I give you all these returns and their risk characteristics, and if you think like that, why wouldn't a prime office building with very good long tenancy and getting a 6% return not be bond-like? And that's the thinking you have to do now, because otherwise you will say, my hurdle rate is 8%, this investment is only will be getting me only 6%, it's a sell proposition. Okay, I'll sell it. What are you going to do with the money? You put it in bonds, it gets you're lucky to get 1%. So that's the kind of thing you have to think about. And that's the change of thinking beginning to happen in the institution investment world. I'm running short of time, I know. Climate change, I won't say very much. This chart just simply show you what are the risks and what are the potential impact. And the next chart show you how you're going to cope with climate change. A lot has been written and talked about. I don't think I can add very much to it. I just want to say that tackling climate change imposes a huge cost, both on governments and as well as individual owners. The problem is that you can't see the payoffs for a long, long time. So it's a really hard decision to make and say whether you spend the money, even if you know that this is a sure thing. But there will be some skeptics to say it may not happen, so why spend the money? To give you an example, the Singapore government has just decided to spend $10 million to study rising sea level, so a much more robust study so that they can help them make some decisions of what to invest. For a start, as you know, that Singapore is extending Changi Airport. So to future-proof it, has decided to raise it by 5 meters, the ground by 5 meters. So that kind of thing has to happen, and those cities that are more prepared, obviously, are going to be relatively better off than other cities, and so is individual assets. So that's all I want to say about climate change. Then on demographics, I think there are two groups that have the most impact on real estate. One is the aging population, and the next is millennials. Looking at the aging stats first, and you can see that already, more than 65 globally is outnumbered children under 5 years old. That is a fact. That's happened. And by 2050, 1 in 6 people in the world will be over 65, and then the older than 80 years old will triple. What are the challenges of it? I mean, there are challenges and there are opportunities, right? Now, of course, in an aging society, it's going to have imbalances. The elderly are probably occupying too much space. They don't need so much space. So what do you do with it? And there's a lot of mismatch, if you like, in housing needs versus actual housing. In an extreme case like Japan, for example, when they have an absolute decline in population, they have now been experiencing an increasing number of unoccupied buildings. I have some stats here which says that it's now about 11% of their stock was unoccupied throughout Japan because of this aging process. Now, of course, a lot of housing types have been built for seniors, and we've got some of them here in Australia. Now, in a landlocked, land scarce island like Singapore, we have come out with solutions like the Kampong Admiralty. Kampong simply means village. And this is a product where they have smaller flats, and I think you can see from there, sitting on a podium, right? So these are 30-year leases. The elderly can sell whatever they own and move to a 30-year lease, smaller apartment and live there. And on the podium, I will have the spec here. It's a 2-story medical centers to provide health service in the podium. It's got child care center and retail outlets. The child care center is really a great concept because this is to encourage intergenerational interaction. Because moms can drop the kids off with grandpa and grandma, and they have children playgrounds and centers and so on. And there are restaurants, and they also generate community activities. So this is one way. And in Holland, for example, this is what they call care home experiments, where students are usually broke. So this is a way in which students get to stay with elderly for free, and their only job is to interact with them, right? And because loneliness is one of the serious problems amongst the elderly. I'm just rushing through this. The Millennials now, as you can see on this chart, the red one, they are the biggest generational cohort in the world going forward in the next 30 years, while the baby boomer, which is the blue line, people like me and some of my older friends here, we are a declining species. So the Millennials are going to determine everything, or a lot of things in the built environment, to determine where and what to live, work, and play. Right? So they are very significant. And their characteristics are very different even from the Gen X, because they tend to delay major life events like marriage and childbearing. They're changing locational preference and attitudes towards home ownership. It's very different. Not many of them care about home ownership. They want to live in the cities, city centers, and those are always places that are most expensive and least affordable. But a lot of corporations are also moving to the city centers. At one stage, they have been going to the suburbs because of the competition for talent to accommodate Millennials. And you see this happening a great deal now in American cities. So, disruptive technology. I think this is the biggest change that's going to happen. That I think the magnitude of technological disruption is much more far-reaching than anything in the past, in affecting all sectors of real estate as we know them today. We are probably only at the beginning of some transformative changes to the way the industry operates. We have some difficulty classifying them. So if I could just run through it quickly, we have the sharing economy is really it's a situation where the new technology is challenging traditional relationship between owner and users, whether it's Airbnb, Uber, co-working or co-living. And we see this happening now for quite a few years. Then the prop tech is now the new thing, threatening the way the industry has been operating. I think one serious challenge is disintermediation, where it is going to disrupt traditional brokerage services. And that tokenization, for example, if it happens, has the potential of simplifying and reducing the cost of property transaction. Big data and data analytics and AI and machine learning I mentioned before are going to challenge professional services, such as whether they are valuers, lawyers, accountants, and engineers. The NUS just developed this what they call the automatic value model with a lot of data. I was going to show this. I don't think we have time to get to about 4 degrees of error margin to do valuation of condominiums. So, but of course, at the moment, it's still not acceptable because there's no human being signing off like a valuer that's qualified and licensed in every jurisdiction. But over time, this is going to happen. Right? This is not just valuer, even lawyers. You don't need a whole lot of lawyers to do case research. The computer can do it better. So those kind of things are going to happen. That the IoT, the Internet of Things, with AI and machine learning, are also going to improve efficiency and also optimization. Really, is to do more with less. So that's the kind of thing happen. Now, I am not the right person to go into the technical details, but I thought I'd share with you one or two things about how the market has been responding to these challenges, and ask the question, how are real estate corporates currently responding to the digital trend? And how has the market been adjusting to specific disruptions which have already been challenging the traditional models for a good number of years, right? And I won't go into a lot of detail. Hopefully, this will give us some indication of how, going forward, the market and the players are going to cope with digital disruption. So, starting with corporates, we know that bricks and mortar companies, corporates, are not the quickest in adapting to new technology, right? And that, not coincidentally, the 3 bricks and mortar companies that I've been associated with in last year, in fact, have all decided, I can assure you they didn't consult each other, to hire a chief technology officer. Now, this is just an indication of how seriously bricks and mortar companies is taking on the challenges that are posed by technology. So, I want to give you an example of how the things have been happening, that the bricks and mortar company is investing in technology to protect themselves. They no longer look at real estate, if you are an asset owner, that you are just selling space, if you like, right? Renting space. That's only one solution. Now they have to look at the whole ecosystem and provide solutions, a whole range of solutions, in order to retain their customers or their tenants. So I want to give you an example of the things that this company that I'm associated with has been doing. It's called GLP, Global Logistic Properties. It was a public company listed in Singapore, was taken private about 2 years ago, and it is arguably the 2nd largest manager of logistic warehouse space in the world, with 75 million square meters of space. Okay, that's the kind of thing they're doing. So as I say, they no longer look at themselves as a landlord, but more as to provide a whole range of solutions for their customers. So what have they done? And warehousing is only one solution, if you think of it. So what have they done? They invested in robotics. Why? Because modern warehousing needs some kind of automation. They have invested in live tracking of trucks. This is very important, not to help their customers to ensure not only safety records but drivers' behavior as well. Smart gates, so that before the trucks arrive, you know when to load, unload, and prepare for it, like when we arrive at the airport. And also technology which can compete with Amazon, for example, to help retailers get goods to customer within 2 days, like Amazon Prime. They are experimenting with flexible warehouse space, which with lots of data storage. Versus traditional leasing, like co-working. Right? And they've been investing heavily in data centers. Actually, data centers, if you think about it, the bricks and mortar is the same. It's the warehouse, it's the equipment, and the data that's different. So now, I have no time to go into specific way. I wanted to talk a little bit about, show you about what's happening in the co-working and e-commerce. But suffice to say that those things have been around for a while. It's starting to unravel. And that in the co-working space, the landlords are now realizing that this is no longer a passing trend, but a reality, providing flexible space. So they are fighting back against the third-party service provider like WeWork, for example. And the WeWork model, as we can see, is starting to unravel when they fail to IPO. Right? So this is how the market is reacting. In fact, in New York, I know for a fact that the big landlords are getting together to talk about how to set up flexible space for their customers and work together and not lose that to third-party operators. In e-commerce, that's, has been very disruptive, but the change is that, two things I want to say. One is that even though as a percentage of total sale, it's not really that much. It's about 10% now, growing from about 4.5% 10 years ago. It's starting to have a serious impact on retailing and shopping centers. But it is not just e-commerce that's the problem. There have been changing demographics, changing tastes and preferences, and so they have to evolve. But the important thing is that both online or offline players are now learning the symbiotic relationship between offline and online selling. The Amazon of this world, for example, are really getting into the physical stores, and the physical store people are going online. So that's what's happening. That's the adaptation that's happening. So I think I've said enough. Sorry if I've taken a little bit more time than been allocated, but I think we started a little. Let me just conclude and said that the global real estate industry has evolved to a high level of sophistication and profitability. But the practices, platforms, and tools we have developed may not be enough for the future. All indications point to the industry undergoing some fundamental change and disruption, posing new threats and challenges, but also opportunities. So the industry will continue to experiment, adapt, innovate as it has done in the past. There will always be winners and losers, but doing nothing is not the answer. And lastly, I just want to say that going forward, there could be added complexity where making a reasonable return from your business may not be enough, because there will be more pressure to also measure corporate investments performance by its environmental, social, and governance standards, the so-called ESG standards. So in advanced economies, that's already starting to happen, and the demand is going to grow. This is an entirely new topic, which I can leave it to the next speaker. Thank you.